The 23-year-old heir tilted his wrist and let the red wine spill across a Persian rug that had been cleaned less than an hour earlier, then snapped his fingers and ordered the maid to kneel and wipe it up. Pierce Ashcroft looked at her and saw exactly what he wanted to see. A gray uniform, hair pinned back, a woman with no name and no one to stand for her. There were two things he didn't know. The first was that he was standing in the Rocca parlor on Beacon Hill, the home of the quietest and most dangerous man in Boston. A man with 3 rules the whole city knew by heart, and one of those rules was that no one raised their voice at the help under his roof. The second, and this was the one that would ruin his entire family, was that the woman kneeling at his feet was Josephine Hartwell, 26 years old, daughter of a dock foreman who had died in a workplace accident 4 years earlier at Ashcroft's own Pier 7. She was raising a 9-year-old brother on 3 jobs and a criminal record for something she never did. For 4 years she had learned that silence was the only thing keeping the two of them safe. She lowered her head, wiped the wine away, and backed out of the room as she always did, unaware that before the night ended, a single sentence from Chairman Randall Ashcroft would turn her blood to ice and end the life she had so carefully built. If this story touched you, leave a like so we know you're listening. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the true, deeply human stories we share every week. And if you believe a person's dignity is never measured by the clothes they wear, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. The wooden door closed softly behind her, and the Rocca dining room sank into a kind of silence that only those accustomed to living in that house understood. Pierce leaned back in his chair, draped one arm over the back of the chair beside him, and looked around the table with the expression of a man who had just finished telling a joke and was waiting to be rewarded. "I have to be honest," he said, his voice carrying slightly louder than necessary in a room occupied by only 6 people. "The quality of service here isn't bad. At my house, if someone spilled wine like that, it would take 15 minutes before anybody came out to clean it up." No one laughed. Bruno Ferraro continued cutting the meat on his plate at the same steady pace, as though he hadn't heard a thing. "Mrs." Ruth Calloway poured more water into Randall's glass, stepped back 3 paces, and took the exact position she'd occupied throughout 20 years of service. Salvatore Rocca said nothing at all. He simply set down his knife, lifted his eyes, and looked at Pierce. There was no anger in that gaze, no threat, not even anything outwardly remarkable. It simply didn't move away. 3 seconds passed, then 5. To an ordinary person, 5 seconds of silence was only 5 seconds. To Pierce Ashcroft, it was an emptiness he had to fill at any cost, because he'd never learned how to exist inside another person's silence. "Did I say something wrong?" He laughed, though the sound that came from his throat was thinner than he'd intended. "Come on, they're paid to do that. That's their job. If they didn't want to kneel down and scrub floors, they should have gotten a better education, shouldn't they?" The sentence fell onto the table and lay there. Bruno stopped moving his knife. "Mrs." Ruth didn't stir, but her fingers tightened around the neck of the water pitcher. Salvatore continued looking at Pierce, and still didn't say a word. In that exact moment, anyone in the room perceptive enough might have realized that the evening had just crossed some invisible line and would never be able to return. Randall Ashcroft was perceptive. He set down his glass, lightly touched the edge of his napkin with his fingertip, then spoke in the tone of a man who had just remembered something interesting. "The Harbor Commission moved the bid review forward by 10 days, he said, smooth as silk, as though nothing at all had happened. "I thought you should know in advance. $200 million is enough to keep a man awake at night, even a man accustomed to large numbers." Salvatore turned toward him slowly. "I don't remember inviting you tonight." Randall smiled, and the smile was handsome enough to appear on the cover of a magazine. "I didn't wait for an invitation. We're neighbors doing business with each other, and I thought sitting down for a civilized conversation would be better than letting our lawyers speak for us." He lifted his glass and turned it gently in his hand. "Besides, this contract doesn't belong to the highest bidder, Mr. Rocca. It belongs to the person who understands that harbor best. And harbors have very long memories. They remember the name of every person who ever worked there." Salvatore didn't answer. He only lifted his glass of water, took a sip, then returned it to precisely the same place, without shifting it even an inch. At the far end of the table, Bruno Ferraro folded his napkin, placed it on his plate, rose, and walked out of the room. No one asked where he was going. No one said anything more about it. Dinner continued for another 20 minutes, polite, seamless, and completely meaningless. By the time everyone stood to leave, The Persian rug was dry. No trace of the wine remained, but in that exact spot, the wool was slightly darker than the rest, and it would remain that way for a very long time. Josie stood in the narrow hallway connecting the dining room to the kitchen, her hands folded over her stomach and her eyes lowered toward the toes of her shoes, exactly as Mrs. Ruth had taught her during her first week. It was where the household staff were supposed to stand when guests were leaving, close enough to open the door if necessary, far enough away that no one had to look at them. During the 14 months she'd worked in that house, she'd stood there hundreds of times, and not one guest had ever turned back to look at her. Chairs scraped backward across the wooden floor. Footsteps followed. Salvatore Rocca said something brief, and Randall Ashcroft answered with a soft laugh. Then he stepped into the hallway, put on his coat, and adjusted his cuff with the unhurried movement of a man who had been given an entire lifetime to do everything slowly. Josie leaned forward and opened the door for him. He didn't step outside. He stopped directly in front of her, closer than necessary, and looked at her for so long that she was forced to raise her eyes. "Hartwell," he said. Nothing more, only her last name, pronounced one syllable at a time, like a man reading the inscription on a gravestone to make sure he still remembered it correctly. Then he smiled, and the smile was perfectly courteous. "Your father worked at Pier 7, didn't he?" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He merely gave a small nod, as though he'd just confirmed a minor detail in a notebook, stepped across the threshold, and descended the front steps toward the waiting car. Pierce followed behind his father, staring at his phone as he walked, completely unaware that only seconds earlier his father had done something more important than everything Pierce had done throughout the entire evening. The door closed. Josie remained exactly where she was. She heard the car engine start in the courtyard, the tires grinding over the gravel, then the sound of the engine fading until it disappeared completely. She still didn't move. There were no thoughts in her mind, only a faint humming sound, like water running through the pipes on the floor below. 4 years. For 4 years, she'd taught herself how to become smaller. She'd learned how to walk close to the walls, how to set down a tray without making a sound, how to answer, "Yes, sir," in a voice so flat that no one could remember its tone. She'd changed her phone number twice. She'd moved 3 times. She'd stopped using her first name when introducing herself to strangers and simply said, "Hartwell," because Josephine sounded too much like someone who had a family, a past, and something to lose. And she'd believed, truly believed, that she'd succeeded. That she'd vanished from those people's memories like a stain wiped clean from the floor. But he'd recognized her, not after dinner, not after hearing someone mention her name. She remembered the moment he'd entered the drawing room earlier that evening, when she'd taken his coat from him and he'd glanced at her once, quickly, before turning away and continuing the conversation he'd already begun. At the time, she'd felt relieved. Now she understood that the glance hadn't meant he hadn't seen her. It had meant that he'd seen her, taken note of her, and stored the knowledge away to use later. He'd known who she was from the first second he'd crossed the threshold of the Rocca house, and he'd sat through the entire dinner, discussed the contract, drunk his wine, laughed with his host, and only then released that sentence just before leaving, in the one place where no one else could hear it. Josie walked into the kitchen. She turned on the faucet, placed the final glass in the sink, and that was when her hand began to shake. It wasn't a slight tremor. Her entire arm shook as though it no longer belonged to her, and the glass slipped from her fingers, struck the side of the stainless steel sink, and shattered into pieces across the tiled floor. The sound was unbearably loud in the empty kitchen. She dropped to her knees at once and reached for the broken pieces, her mind racing through the familiar calculations. 1 crystal glass, perhaps $300, perhaps more, deducted from this month's wages. And more important than any of that, Mrs. Ruth would ask why. Josie had prepared her answer before the broken glass had even touched the floor. "My hand was slippery from the dish soap. I'm sorry. I'll pay for it." Footsteps sounded behind her. Mrs. Ruth Calloway stood in the doorway, still holding a dish towel, looking down at the floor. Josie lowered her head farther and opened her mouth. "Mrs. Ruth. Mrs. Ruth didn't let her finish. She walked over, knelt down beside her, and began picking up the larger pieces between 2 fingers, carefully, one at a time, placing each piece in the palm of her other hand. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask whether Josie was all right. She didn't say anything at all. Josie looked up at her. And for one very brief moment, She saw something on the face of the 63-year-old woman that she couldn't understand. It wasn't irritation. It wasn't pity either. It looked like the expression of someone watching an event they'd always known would happen. Something they'd been waiting a very long time to see. "Leave it, Mrs." Ruth said in her usual voice. "Go get the broom. Watch the piece beside the table leg." Josie stood and went to get the broom. When she returned, Mrs. Ruth had already gathered most of the broken glass and was standing at the sink, rinsing her hands beneath the running water. She still didn't ask anything. For 14 months, whenever anything happened in that kitchen, no matter how small, Mrs. Ruth had always asked questions. She asked a great many questions. That was how she managed the house. That night, she didn't ask a single one. Josie was too consumed by fear to recognize how unusual that was. It would take her many more months to understand. Josie reached the apartment at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning and slept for about 4 hours. For most of the remaining time, she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the water pipes inside the walls. At 6:30, she got up, and the first scent of the day was warm milk because Toby had gone into the kitchen before her. "Josie, come here. Hurry. You have to see this." The 9-year-old boy stood beside the dining table, holding something nearly half as tall as he was, his face glowing as though he'd just invented electricity. It was a ship. He'd built it from 7 empty milk cartons stacked on top of one another and fastened together with clear tape. The hull had been colored ocean blue with crayons layered over each other again and again, and on top was a smokestack made from an empty toilet paper roll. Along both sides of the ship, the boy had drawn long rows of tiny squares. "These are containers," Toby explained, his voice as serious as an engineer presenting a design to a committee. "Container ships have to carry lots of them. I counted in a book that some ships can carry as many as 18,000. I only drew 64 because I ran out of room. You count them." Josie really did count. She sat down, leaned close, and counted each little square, one by one, saying the numbers aloud. And when she lost count somewhere around the 30th square, the boy burst into helpless laughter and made her start over from the beginning. She started over. There are mornings in a person's life whose value doesn't come from anything grand, but from the fact that a child makes you count 64 squares drawn in colored pencil, and you have 10 full minutes to count every last one. "Josie, when are you going to take me to the harbor?" He asked that question every week, and she always gave him the same answer. "When I get 1 whole day off." "So when are you going to get 1 whole day off?" "Soon." "You've been saying soon since my birthday." Josie laughed. "Yes, I have, but this time I mean it." Toby narrowed his eyes at her with the look of a child deciding whether or not to believe. And then he chose to believe, because children always choose to believe, and that is both the most beautiful thing about them and the thing that frightens adults most. "I want to see a real ship come into the harbor," he said. "I want to watch them lift the containers off. Dad worked there, didn't he?" Josie was pouring water, and her hand paused for the length of a single heartbeat before she continued. "Yes, Dad worked there. I don't remember his face very well," the boy said, completely matter of fact, neither sad nor cheerful, the way a child who lost his father at the age of 5 still speaks about such things. "But I remember him carrying me on his shoulders. It was so high." "Dad carried you on his shoulders all the time," Josie said. "He said you were as heavy as a sack of cement." Toby roared with laughter, delighted, and demanded that she tell the story about the sack of cement again. Just then, there came a knock at the door, 3 familiar short taps, and Mrs. Delphine pushed the door open without waiting for anyone to answer, because she'd been entering the apartment that way for nearly 3 years. She was 68 years old, lived at the far end of the hallway, and always had something in her hands. "Apple pie," she announced, setting a cloth-covered plate on the table. "I made too much and can't finish it. Take a piece to work with you, and don't go hungry." "You always make too much," Josie said. "I'm old, so I forget the measurements," Mrs. Delphine replied without blinking, then turned toward the boy. "And you, mister? Engineer, you and I have work to do today. This ship is missing an anchor. A ship without an anchor will drift away." Toby's mouth fell open. "That's right, I forgot. I've got some braided cord and a few corks at my place. We can make an anchor." Mrs. Delphine put his hat on him, checked the clasp on his school bag, and while the boy hurried off to fetch his ship, she turned toward Josie and lowered her voice slightly. "You got home late last night? My employer had guests. Have you eaten breakfast?" I'll eat at work. Liar, Mrs. Delphine said, then pushed another paper-wrapped package into the pocket of Josie's coat before she had time to refuse. That was what happened in the apartment almost every day. An elderly woman who wasn't related to either of them still cooked too much, still remembered vaccination dates, still stood at the window and watched until the boy disappeared from sight. Josie put on her coat, bent down, and held her brother tightly, listening as he reminded her, "Come home early, okay?" Then she went down the stairs. She stepped onto the sidewalk, pulled up the collar of her coat, and was about to turn left toward the subway station. Then she stopped. Across the street, about 20 meters from the entrance of the building, a gray car was parked close to the curb. Its windows were darkly tinted. No one got out. No one got in. Josie stared at it for a few more seconds, then told herself that cars were always parked around this neighborhood, that she was tired, that she was imagining things. She walked another 10 steps or so when something inside her mind came alive with sudden clarity. It wasn't deduction. It was pure memory. That car had been parked in the exact same place the evening before, when she'd left for work. She remembered because she'd had to walk around the rear of it to cross the street. It had remained there, unmoving, through the entire night. She didn't look back. She kept walking at the same pace, one hand gripping the strap of her bag, and her mind kept echoing those parting words spoken so politely in the hallway the night before. "Your father worked at Pier 7, didn't he?" Josie arrived at the Beacon Hill mansion at 8:45, and Mrs. Ruth Calloway was already standing at the kitchen entrance with her notebook in hand. She didn't mention the glass that had shattered the night before. She only said, "You'll do the second floor and the outer study today," then handed Josie the list. But halfway through the morning, while the two of them were folding towels in the linen room, Mrs. Ruth suddenly stopped. "How long have you worked here?" 14 months. Then you must know the rules by now." Josie nodded, and Mrs. Ruth shook her head. "No, I'm asking seriously. Recite them for me." Josie set down the towel. She remembered because during her first week, Mrs. Ruth had made her repeat them 3 times until she knew them by heart. Rule 1. Never enter the study while the door is closed, no matter what sound you hear from inside. Rule 2. Never speak the master's name outside these gates, not even to family, not even when asked. And Rule 3. Mrs. Ruth looked at her. That is the important one. No one in this house is allowed to raise their voice at a member of the staff. Josie recited. No one. Go on. Not even guests. Mrs. Ruth nodded slowly, then did something she'd never done before. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Do you know why that rule exists? I didn't ask. No, you didn't. You never ask anything, and that is why I kept you. Mrs. Ruth smoothed the towel across her lap. I've done this work for more than 40 years, Miss Hartwell. I've served families whose names are on buildings, on avenues, even carved into church pews. And I will tell you this. People don't mistreat servants because they hate servants. They do it because they need someone beneath them. They need someone to prove that they themselves are above. Every house is the same in that respect. She paused. This house isn't, and that isn't because of me. It is his rule. He established it during the first year after he took over. No explanation, no changes, no exceptions. Josie thought of the wine stain on the Persian rug the night before, of the fingers snapping in the air, of the 5 seconds of silence she'd managed to hear from the hallway before the door had fully closed. There was an exception last night, she said quietly. No, Mrs. Ruth replied, and something in her voice made Josie look up. There are no exceptions. He simply hasn't finished dealing with it yet. The Rocca house moved according to a rhythm of its own, and that rhythm was entirely out of step with the rest of Beacon Hill. Dinner was served late. Music was never played. There were landline telephones in 3 places throughout the house, and none of them ever rang twice in a row. Josie had learned that when the study door was closed, the first-floor hallway had to remain empty, and when Bruno Ferraro climbed the stairs without removing his coat, it meant something had happened, and the wisest thing to do was go down to the kitchen and find some work. That night, she stayed late because the wooden floor on the first floor needed to be refinished, the section of hallway leading from the foyer to the study. It was nearly 11 o'clock when she finished, and stood waiting for the floor to dry before laying the rug back down. And that was when she heard the front door. Salvatore Rocca returned alone, his coat folded over one arm. He stepped into the foyer, and Josie immediately moved back against the wall by instinct, holding the rolled rug in both arms with her head lowered. He stopped at the edge of the hallway. The floor was still dark with water, reflecting the light in one long streak. He looked at it for about a second, then turned to the right and went around through the kitchen entrance, a route nearly 20 steps longer than the straight path, so he wouldn't walk across the place she'd just cleaned. He didn't say anything to her. He didn't look at her either. She remained where she was, listening to his footsteps circling through the kitchen, hearing the faucet turn on and then off, hearing a glass being set down on the stone counter. He poured his own water. In a house with 7 servants and a call bell in every room, that man walked around through the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water at 11 o'clock at night. That was everything that happened. There were no words, no exchanged glances, but Josie stood there with the rolled rug in her arms and realized that in the past 4 years, no one had ever walked around to avoid the place she'd just cleaned. People stepped on it, and told her to clean it again. She was still thinking about that when a key turned in the front door and Bruno Ferraro entered, still wearing his coat. He didn't take it off. Josie held the rolled rug close and immediately turned toward the kitchen passage, but sound carried easily through the hallways of the old house, and she heard 4 sentences before she could disappear from view. Ashcroft is ahead. By how much? Enough that the committee won't need a second round of voting. Then came a pause, and Bruno's voice dropped lower and became slower. The problem is, I can't explain why. Their bid isn't the best. Their technical proposal isn't either. But they have something in their possession that we can't see, Mr. Rocca. There is something at that harbor we can't see. The study door closed. Josie stood in the dark kitchen, holding the rolled rug, unable to understand why her heart was beating so quickly at the sound of the word harbor. 3 days later, Josie finished her shift at 10 o'clock at night and walked down into the underground parking garage beneath the neighboring building, the only shortcut to the subway station that didn't require her to circle around 2 entire blocks. Only half the lights in that basement ever worked, and every footstep echoed off the concrete ceiling as though someone were walking close behind. She'd taken that route for 14 months and had never been troubled by it. That night, when she rounded the 3rd support column, a white Audi was parked across the pedestrian path, and Pierce Ashcroft was sitting on the hood with his legs swinging, a phone in one hand. "Good evening," he said. Josie stopped for the length of a single heartbeat, then kept walking, changing direction to pass around the rear of the car. He jumped down and cut across her path. He didn't touch her. He only stood there, close enough that she had to stop. "Josephine Hartwell," he read, drawing out each word as though he were tasting it. "It took me 2 days to find your full name. You're very good at hiding." She didn't answer. He raised his phone and took a photograph, the flash exploding white across her face in the darkness of the garage. She blinked, and he took another. "Beautiful. The uniform still has all its creases." He turned the screen toward her. It wasn't the photograph he'd just taken. It was a document captured from a computer screen, the lettering small. But she recognized it immediately, because she'd read it more often than anything else in her life. A court record. Her name. The charge. The dates. Theft of property. Pierce read aloud, his voice thick with delight. "Jewelry. 4 years ago. Was it your former employer? My God, you stole from your old employer, and now you scrub floors for the Rocca family. Does Mr. Rocca know about this?" Josie remained still. Inside her mind, something had begun counting down very slowly, something she'd taught herself to activate over the past 4 years. A small clock reminding her that every answer was a rope, and people only needed one rope to drag her under. "I'm asking you a serious question," he continued, taking one slow step around her. "I'm trying to decide. If I send this to Mr. Rocca, you lose your job, but if I send it to the newspapers, that would be much more entertaining. The most notorious crime boss in Boston hires a thief to clean his house. People love reading stories like that." She still didn't speak. "Are you mute?" No answer. "I'm talking to you." No answer. And that was when everything in Pierce Ashcroft's face began to change. Some people are raised on the reactions of others, and when no reaction comes, they no longer know where they exist. He'd prepared himself for her to beg. He'd prepared for her to cry, argue, threaten to call security, plead with him not to send the record. He had an answer ready for every one of those things. He had no answer for a woman who stood staring at the concrete floor and refused to open her mouth. "Do you think you're better than me?" His voice rose, striking the basement ceiling and echoing back. "You stand there pretending. Do you know what you are? You're the person I pay to clean up the wine I spill. That's all. I snap my fingers, and you get down on your knees. You already did it. Everyone in that room saw you. Josie raised her eyes. She looked at him once, for no more than 2 seconds, and there was no hatred in her gaze, no fear, nothing at all. Then she stepped to the left, walked around him, and continued toward the stairwell. Hey! She didn't stop. Hey! I'm not finished. Her shoes struck the concrete in an even rhythm. You'll lose your job this week, do you hear me? This week. She turned into the stairwell and disappeared from his sight. Pierce remained alone in the parking garage, breathing hard, his phone still in his hand, and he shouted one more sentence into the empty space merely to prove to himself that what had just happened had truly happened. In the corner of the ceiling, about 15 meters from where he stood, a gray camera housing was mounted to a concrete column, its red light blinking at a steady pace. The underground garage belonged to an office building, and that office building had changed ownership 2 years earlier. Pierce didn't know this, though in truth he'd never developed the habit of looking up at ceilings. The following morning, Bruno Ferraro sat in the study of the Rocca house, turned his laptop screen toward the desk, and pressed play. The footage had no sound. It didn't need any. Salvatore watched it once from beginning to end without speaking. Then he signaled with 2 fingers, and Bruno rewound it to the exact moment Josie lifted her head and looked directly at Pierce. Salvatore watched that moment 3 times. How long ago? He asked. Tuesday night, 2 nights ago. Anything else? A car has been parked outside her building. The registration belongs to a rental. The renter is a private security company in Providence. I'm still tracing it. Salvatore tapped 1 finger against the desk once, very softly. Did she tell anyone? Bruno shook his head. No. She arrived at work on time, completed her shift, and didn't say anything to anyone. Mrs. Ruth said she hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Salvatore remained silent for quite a while. Outside the window, a garbage truck rumbled past on the street. Then, he said, Don't let her know that I know. Bruno looked up. You aren't going to say anything to her? She chose silence. People stay silent because they've calculated that speaking will cost them more. Salvatore closed the laptop and pushed it back toward Bruno. If I question her, I become the second man forcing her to open her mouth. I won't do that. Leave everything as it is, and have someone follow her home every night. Keep your distance. Don't let her see them. Pierce Ashcroft had said it would happen that week, and he kept his word, except he struck Josie in the one place she hadn't expected. On Thursday morning, the shift manager at the laundromat on Cambridge Street called her at 7:15, his voice so uneasy that she understood before he finished the sentence. The laundromat had to make cuts. It wasn't her fault. She'd done excellent work, and he was very sorry. Josie asked whether it would begin the following week, or that very day. He remained silent for 3 seconds, then said that it began that day, and ended the call more quickly than necessary. By Saturday afternoon, the restaurant in the North End sent her a text message instead of calling. 3 lines, no explanation, and the name of the manager at the bottom belonged to the same man who had told her only the month before that they were short-staffed on the night shift, and she could work as many evenings as she wanted. Josie sat on the stairs in the hallway of her apartment building, read the message 4 times, and saw with perfect clarity the image of a young man sitting on the hood of a white car, swinging his legs with a phone in his hand. She had no proof. She also knew that searching for proof would only make everything worse. People didn't fire her by stating the reason. They fired her by leaving an empty space where the reason should have been, and no one could sue an empty space. She went over the numbers in her head, the rent, the electricity bill, the money she set aside each month for the hospital, and realized that if the Rocca house became her only job, there would be nothing left to set aside. She didn't tell Mrs. Delphine. She didn't tell Toby. On Monday morning, she arrived in Beacon Hill at 8:45, exactly as she always did, and the first thing she saw when she entered the kitchen was Mrs. Ruth Calloway standing beside the table with an opened envelope in her hand. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, the kind of paper people used for invitations rather than letters. On the table beside her elbow lay several printed pages. "Close the door for me, Mrs." Ruth said. Josie closed it. "Mrs." Ruth pushed the top page toward her, and Josie didn't need to bend down to know what it was because she'd already seen it on a phone screen in the underground parking garage 6 days earlier. The same document, the same line of bold print across the middle of the page. Attached to it was a small handwritten note. The writing slanted and heavy, the sort of handwriting that belonged to someone taught beautiful penmanship as a child, but who had never once been required to use it for anything decent. You should know who you're employing. Josie stood there with her arms hanging at her sides, listening to the heating system running inside the wall. Something strange happens in moments like that. A person doesn't feel panic. A person only feels tired. She'd rehearsed this scene in her mind too many times over 4 years, in too many different kitchens, and now that it was finally happening, it felt like nothing more than a task that needed to be finished. She opened her mouth to say what she'd always planned to say, that she would collect her things immediately, that she didn't want to cause trouble for anyone. Mrs. Ruth didn't let her speak. She picked up the page with both hands and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was very clear in the silent kitchen. She placed the 2 halves together and tore them again, until they became a handful of scraps in her palm. Then she lifted the lid of the trash bin beneath the sink, dropped everything inside, and closed it. Mrs. Ruth, Josie said softly. Sit down. She sat. Mrs. Ruth pulled out the chair opposite her, placed both hands on the table, and looked at her for a long time before speaking. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to answer me honestly. During the past 14 months, did you ever believe that we didn't know? Josie looked up. Didn't know what? What is lying in the trash bin? The kitchen was silent. Josie could hear her heartbeat inside her ears. We've known since the first day, Mrs. Ruth said. Not the first week. The first day. Before you even came for the interview. She pushed the cream-colored envelope aside as though it were something filthy. And I wasn't the first person to read it. The master read it before I did. Josie sat perfectly still. She heard every word, but the words wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning. For 14 months, she'd lived inside that house with one thing lodged in her heart, the fear that one day they would discover the truth. She'd calculated every answer, every gap in her employment history, every time someone asked where she'd worked before. She'd gone to sleep with that fear and awakened with it, and now someone had just told her that the fear had never existed, that the door she'd guarded for 14 months had been standing wide open from the beginning. Then why? She stopped. Her throat was dry. Why did you still hire me? Mrs. Ruth Calloway didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the table, and for one very brief moment, so brief that Josie almost missed it, the face of the 63-year-old woman tightened slightly, like someone who had touched something hot and was trying not to pull her hand away. Then it passed. That, she said, rising and picking up the work ledger, isn't my story to tell, Mrs. Ruth. There are guests coming to view the paintings on the 2nd floor today. Please wipe down the stair railing again. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped without turning around. And the person who sent that envelope, she said, he thinks he just threw a bomb into this house. He doesn't know that he just showed us what he's holding in his hand. Then she left. The Thornbury Club stood on Beacon Street, had existed since before the Civil War, and in more than 150 years, it had changed only its carpets, never its way of thinking. Randall Ashcroft ate lunch there every Wednesday, always at the corner table beside the window, always ordering the same dish. That Wednesday afternoon, just as the server removed the first plate, Salvatore Rocca pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down without asking. Randall didn't flinch. He merely set down his fork, wiped the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and smiled as though he'd been expecting this for a long time. Mr. Rocca, I thought this place hadn't accepted a new member since 1970. I'm not a member. Salvatore placed a small printed photograph face down on the table, then pushed it across the white cloth with 2 fingers. Randall turned it over. It was a frame taken from security footage, black and white, slightly grainy from being enlarged. The image showed an underground parking garage, a sports car blocking the pedestrian path, and a young man standing in the way of a uniformed woman, holding a phone up in front of her face. The angle captured both the license plate and his face clearly. Randall studied the photograph for about 3 seconds, then placed it neatly beside his plate, and continued cutting his meat. Clear picture, he said. Cameras are much better than they used to be. Your son cornered a member of my staff in an underground parking garage at 10 o'clock at night, Salvatore said. His voice didn't rise at all. Even someone seated at the next table wouldn't have heard him. 2 days later, both of her other employers dismissed her within the same week. Yesterday, an envelope was delivered directly to my kitchen. Randall lifted his glass of water. Young people are reckless these days. My boy is 23, the age when people imagine everything they do is important. Mr. Ashcroft. Randall stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth. There is a rule in my house, Salvatore said. Only one, and everyone in Boston knows it. I won't repeat it for you. I will only tell you this. Keep your son away from my people. If I have to say this a second time, I won't be saying it to you. In 40 years of doing business in that city, Randall Ashcroft had heard hundreds of threats, and he'd learned that the most frightening ones were always spoken the most softly, but he didn't turn pale. He didn't set his glass down too quickly. He finished his sip, placed the glass precisely inside the old ring of moisture on the tablecloth, and when he looked up, the same courteous smile remained on his face, neither wider nor smaller. Do you know what I like about you, Mr. Rocca? He said. You're respectable. Truly. Your father was different. He did business the old way. Loud, visible, with everyone knowing his face. But you have cleaned things up very neatly over the past 5 years. Cold storage, transportation, permits, everything in proper order. People are beginning to forget what the Rocca name originally meant. That is an achievement. He folded his napkin slowly, one crease at a time. But do you know the difficulty with cleaning things up? You can only clean what you can see. This city keeps all kinds of things. Documents, reports, files sitting in boxes in basement rooms that no one ever bothers to open. He placed the folded napkin on the table. Last month, I had to request a record from the police department. A property matter. Terribly dull. While I was waiting, I spoke with an old acquaintance. He told me there are cases people can't close, Mr. Rocca. Not because the evidence is missing, because no one has asked for them to be opened. Randall stood and put on his coat. Your father has been gone 5 years now, hasn't he? November. Salvatore didn't move. I sent flowers at the time, Randall said. I don't know whether your family received them. He gave a courteous nod, picked up his hat, and walked toward the door. After several steps, he turned back, and this time his voice softened until it was almost intimate. Oh, Mr. Rocca, you may keep the photograph. I don't need it. Then he left the dining room. Salvatore Rocca remained alone at the corner table beside the window for another 10 minutes or so. A server came over and asked whether he wanted anything, and he shook his head. He sat there arranging everything that had just happened inside his mind, not according to emotion, but according to sequence, the way he'd handled everything since the age of 28. He'd come there with one very simple assumption, that this was a matter of an insolent 23-year-old boy and a father who would be forced to deal with his son. He'd prepared himself for Randall Ashcroft to become angry, deny everything, or offer a hollow apology while allowing it all to continue. He hadn't prepared himself for the man to look at an image of his own son caught on camera without blinking once. An ordinary father would panic. A clever father would pretend to panic. Randall Ashcroft had done neither because the photograph wasn't a threat to him. It was a piece on the board he'd already anticipated and was prepared to sacrifice, which meant that whatever he held in his hand was worth far more to him than his own son. And then he'd spoken about records, about a basement, about November, about a case no one had asked to reopen. Salvatore sat perfectly still. He remembered that November night. He remembered the hospital corridor. He remembered the report they had placed before him to sign at 4 o'clock in the morning, when he was 28 years old and hadn't yet understood what he'd just lost. For 5 years, he'd kept that matter closed and hadn't opened it once. Now a man had mentioned it over lunch in the voice of someone placing a coin on the table long enough for his opponent to see it before slipping it back into his pocket. Salvatore picked up the photograph, folded it in half, and placed it inside his coat. When he reached the club entrance, he took out his phone and called Bruno Ferraro. The car outside her building, he said. Stop tracing it. Change direction. To where? Pier 7. I want to know what happened there 4 years ago. The laundry room in the Rocca mansion was in the basement, at the end of a hallway tiled in white, and it was the only room in the house where the sound of the machines drowned out everything else. Josie liked working there for that very reason. On Friday afternoon, she was folding the second load of bath towels when the phone in her apron pocket began to vibrate, and the screen showed the number she'd saved under a name 2 years earlier, the number that made her heart miss a beat whenever it appeared, before she even had time to think. She wiped her hands on her apron before answering. The person on the other end was a surgical scheduling coordinator, a woman whose voice Josie had heard often enough to recognize every shade within it. She said Josie's name first, then Toby's, then the boy's date of birth, following procedure exactly, and Josie stood there with a bath towel in her hands, waiting for her to finish the entire routine. Then the woman said that the schedule on their end had to be adjusted. Josie asked which date it was being moved to. The woman said there wasn't a new date yet. Josie asked when there would be one, and a silence opened on the other end of the line. The kind of silence she'd learned to read over the past 4 years. The empty space people left where an answer should have been. Then the woman said, in a voice that had grown much softer, that the case had been placed on hold by the financial department, that the remaining balance was $40,000, and that until the amount was resolved, the scheduling office couldn't place him on any surgical calendar. Josie asked only one more question, whether that meant the surgery was postponed indefinitely, and the woman said yes, I'm very sorry. A dryer was running in the corner of the room, turning at a steady pace, metal striking metal in an unchanging rhythm. Josie could hear it very clearly. She said thank you. She said yes, I understand. She said please call me at any time if anything changes, even in the evening. Then she ended the call, slipped the phone back into her apron pocket, and picked up the towel she'd left unfinished. She folded it in half lengthwise, smoothed it flat, folded it in half again, smoothed it flat, folded it into thirds across the width, adjusted the edges until they met perfectly, then placed it on the stack beside her and reached for the next one. She did exactly the same thing with the second towel, then the third. In the basement laundry room of the Rocca house that afternoon, a 26-year-old woman stood folding bath towels, and had anyone walked in at that moment, they would have seen only a household worker doing her job, at the proper pace, with the proper folds, neither faster nor slower than usual. They wouldn't have seen anything at all unless they happened to notice her hands. Those hands remained against the fabric longer than necessary. They smoothed and smoothed again over a crease that had long since become flat, pressing down, sliding outward to both sides, then pressing down once more, as though if she pressed hard enough, the cloth would become so perfectly smooth that there would be no room left in the world for anything else to exist. She folded the entire stack. Then she placed the towels in a basket, carried them to the second floor, arranged them in their proper cabinets, and went down to the kitchen to ask Mrs. Ruth whether there was anything else she needed to finish. Mrs. Ruth said no. Go home. You've worked faster than usual today. Josie walked to the subway station. On the train, she stood holding the overhead strap and looked out through the dark window. And there was no $40,000 in her mind. No Pierce Ashcroft. No laundromat. No restaurant in the North End. There was only one very small and very foolish question, what she would say that evening, when the boy asked whether there was any news. She'd promised him in March, then promised him again in May. She reached the third floor, unlocked the door, and found the apartment dark because Mrs. Delphine had taken Toby across the hallway for dinner, as she did every Friday. Josie turned on the kitchen light. In the center of the dining table lay a sheet of A4 paper, placed carefully and held down at all 4 corners by 4 bottle caps, the kind of arrangement made by a child afraid the wind might carry away his work. It was a drawing. A container ship with a blue hull and a red smokestack was approaching a pier marked with a number drawn in bold. On the deck were 2 people, one tall and one short, holding hands, and the taller figure had hair tied back behind her head. Beneath them, written carefully 1 letter at a time in blue crayon, was a sentence. For Josie. The letter I had been replaced by a Y, and that Y was much larger than all the other letters, its tail stretching almost to the bottom edge of the paper because by the time he reached it, there was no room left. Josie stood in the kitchen with the key still in her hand, staring at the long tail of that Y. She stood there for a very long time. Then she set the key down, opened a drawer, took out a roll of tape, cut 4 equal pieces, and fixed the drawing to the refrigerator door beside the stack of bills. She hung it straight, adjusting it twice until it was even. Then she stepped back to look at it, and at that exact moment she heard the boy's laughter drifting from the far end of the hallway, the sound of his feet running across the floor, and Mrs. Delphine calling for him to slow down before he spilled all the cake. Josie drew in a breath, lifted the corners of her mouth, and went to open the door. The envelope arrived on Tuesday morning, and it hadn't come through the mail. Mrs. Delphine found it wedged into the apartment door when she came to collect Toby, and she carried it inside and handed it to Josie with a puzzled expression because there was no stamp on it, No postmark, no name of a sender, only 4 bold typewritten words in the center: Josephine Hartwell. Josie opened it beside the kitchen sink while her hands were still wet. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a payment receipt from Boston Children's Hospital, printed on watermarked paper with a circular seal in the lower right corner. Patient's name, Tobias Hartwell. Case number, date. And on the final line, where the outstanding balance appeared, one phrase was printed more boldly than everything else: paid in full. She read the page 4 times. Then she placed it on the table, dried her hands, picked up her phone, and called the hospital. The woman in the financial department confirmed it quickly, almost cheerfully, saying that yes, the balance had been paid on Saturday, and the file had been returned to the scheduling department so they could assign a date, and Josie should receive a call sometime that week. Josie asked who had made the payment. There was a pause, and then the woman said that the paying party had requested confidentiality, and that the hospital wasn't legally permitted to disclose the information. Josie asked again, more softly this time, almost pleading. The answer remained the same. She ended the call and stood leaning against the edge of the kitchen table. And the strange thing was that what rose inside her chest wasn't relief. It was a feeling of losing her footing, like missing a step in the dark. For 4 years, she'd learned that nothing in this world ever arrived on its own, that everything people gave you came with a price written somewhere in very small print. $40,000 wasn't a gift. It was a hook. She could think of only one person. She thought of the man who had known about her criminal record before she'd even come for the interview, and had hired her anyway. The man who had walked around through the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, so he wouldn't step on the floor she'd just cleaned. Josie arrived in Beacon Hill an hour early with the receipt in her coat pocket. She worked through the entire morning with it resting there, and every time she passed the study, her steps slowed slightly. "Mrs." Ruth said something about wiping down the dining room window frames again, and Josie answered, "Yes, ma'am," but she couldn't remember whether she'd actually done it. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Bruno Ferraro left the house. The first-floor hallway was empty. The study door stood slightly open. The first rule of the house, the one Mrs. Ruth had made her repeat 3 times during her first week, was never to enter the study while the door was closed, no matter what sound came from inside. Josie stood in front of that door for about 10 seconds. Then she knocked twice and pushed it open. Salvatore Rocca was seated behind his desk, with an open file in front of him, and a pen lying across the page. He looked up, and there was no anger on his face, only the faint surprise of a man accustomed to never being disturbed. Josie closed the door behind her, walked 3 steps toward the desk, took the paper from her coat pocket, and placed it on the wood facing him. "This was you, wasn't it, sir?" He looked down at the paper. He didn't touch it. He read from the top to the bottom, and Josie stood there watching his eyes move over every line, while everything she'd planned to say waited inside her. That she would repay every dollar, even if it took 10 years. That she couldn't accept it. That he didn't understand what something like this meant to someone like her. That a debt owed to a man like him could never truly be repaid. That if he needed her to do something in exchange for the money, he should tell her plainly now, right now, and not make her wait. She'd rehearsed it again and again all morning. Salvatore looked up. "It wasn't me." Josie didn't move. "Did you hear me?" he said. "It wasn't me." And in that moment, the woman who had worked in his house for 14 months saw something very few people in Boston had ever seen. Salvatore Rocca picked up the receipt. He read it again, more slowly this time, and a crease appeared between his eyebrows. He turned the paper over to see whether anything had been written on the back. There was nothing. He set it down, and one finger tapped the surface of the desk exactly once. "Who gave you this?" "It was wedged into the door of my apartment. There was no stamp." "Have you called the hospital?" "Yes, sir. They said the person who paid requested confidentiality." He sat without moving. Outside the window came the sound of someone dragging a trash bin along the street. "I'm sorry I came in here," Josie said. "I know I'm not allowed. I only thought." She stopped. "I only thought it was you, because there isn't anyone else." Salvatore said nothing for a long time. Then he pushed the paper back toward her across the desk. "Miss Hartwell, let me ask you something. During the past 4 years, has anyone ever given you anything without demanding something in return?" Josie lowered her eyes. "No, sir." "Then you and I are thinking the same thing." He stood, walked to the window, and remained there with his back to her. $40,000 is a great deal of money to an ordinary person and a very small amount to someone wealthy. People don't spend $40,000 out of kindness toward someone whose face they have never seen. They spend it to buy something. He turned and looked at her. The question is what they are buying, and who they are buying it from. Josie stood in the middle of the study, holding the receipt, and for the first time in 4 years, the fear inside her chest had no shape at all. The annual Boston Harbor Commission fundraiser was held in the grand ballroom of the Senate Hotel on Congress Street, and every year there were 200 guests, and every year they were the same faces. The Rocca family had a table. The Ashcroft family had a table. Mrs. Ruth was hired by the organizers to coordinate the service staff as she was every year. And because Josie had lost both of her other jobs, Mrs. Ruth told her to come along, carry drink trays, be paid by the hour, and finish at 11 o'clock. She said it in her usual voice, as though the idea had only just occurred to her, but Josie knew Mrs. Ruth had never only just thought of anything. At 7 o'clock that evening, Josie put on the white shirt and black apron worn by the service staff, stood in line to receive her tray at the kitchen entrance, and stepped into the ballroom. She'd done this kind of work for years, and she knew how to become invisible in a crowded room, moving along the edges, never crossing anyone's line of sight, stopping half a step behind a guest's right shoulder before offering the tray. For the first 2 hours, everything passed exactly that way. She saw Salvatore Rocca once, standing in conversation with a silver-haired woman wearing an organizer's badge, and he didn't look in her direction. She saw Randall Ashcroft more often because he moved constantly through the ballroom, shaking hands with one person after another, smiling at everyone, and at one point he passed her tray, took a glass, nodded a perfectly courteous thank you, and gave no sign that he'd ever seen her before. That was what made her stomach turn cold. At 9:30, the organizers invited everyone toward the center of the ballroom for the speeches. The crowd pressed together more tightly, and Josie had to weave through them to collect empty glasses. She was moving back toward table number 4 when someone lightly touched her tray. It wasn't hard. Only the faintest touch against the left edge, the kind made by someone brushing past without meaning to. She steadied the tray by instinct and glanced down to see whether any glasses had spilled. None had, but between 2 empty glasses, on the steel surface of the tray, a small object lay catching the light from the chandelier. A ring, white gold, with a large stone and an old-fashioned design. Josie stopped in the middle of the ballroom. For about a second and a half, her mind went completely blank, and within that second and a half, she managed to form only one thought, that she had to take it to the reception desk and report it as lost property. Right now, walk straight there, don't stop. She hadn't taken a single step. "My mother's ring." The voice came from behind her, loud and clear, forced to its full volume so it would cut through the music and conversation. An entire section of the ballroom turned. "My mother's ring is on her tray." Pierce Ashcroft strode forward, pointing directly at her hand, his face flushed with what anyone would have read as righteous anger. "I left it in the pocket of my coat hanging over the chair. I went back for it, and it was gone. And now it is on her tray." The music stopped. At the podium, the silver-haired woman wearing the organizer's badge broke off in the middle of a sentence. 200 faces turned in one direction, and that direction was a woman in a black apron, standing in the middle of the ballroom, with a tray in her hands. "Search her pockets," Pierce said. "Search her. This woman has a criminal record for theft. I know for certain. Her name is in the court records." Josie said nothing. That was the strangest thing to the people who witnessed what happened that night. And later, many of them would say that what they remembered most wasn't the young man's shouting, but the fact that the woman never opened her mouth. She didn't protest her innocence. She didn't say, "I didn't take it." She didn't step back, raise her hands, or look around for someone to help her. She simply stood still, both hands continuing to hold the tray steady so it wouldn't tilt, her eyes fixed on the steel surface, and anyone perceptive enough would have noticed that she was breathing very slowly and evenly, the way a person breathes when counting silently in their mind. Because 4 years earlier, in another hallway, before different faces, she'd fought back. She'd said it wasn't me. She'd said I never went into that room. She'd kept speaking until her voice broke, and she demanded that they call the police because she believed the police would stand with the truth. The police had come, and everything she had was taken from her within the next 11 days, because there had been someone in that room who signed a piece of paper, and people believed the paper instead of believing her. From that day forward, she'd learned something no one ever wanted to learn, that once people had decided who you were, every word you spoke only made the sentence against you thicker. A hotel security guard stepped forward and took hold of her arm. The tray tilted, 2 empty glasses rolled onto the carpet, and the ring slid after them, falling face up onto the red carpet, sparkling brightly in the center of the circle that was closing around her. Someone gasped. A woman whispered to the person beside her, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, that these days you never knew what kind of people they were hiring into places like this. Pierce Ashcroft stood 3 steps away with both hands on his hips, and on his face was something he hadn't managed to conceal, something he'd been waiting for during the 2 weeks since that night in the underground parking garage when someone had walked away without bothering to answer him. It was satisfaction. Josie raised her eyes. She didn't look at Pierce. She looked toward the far end of the ballroom, where a man in a dark suit had just set his glass down on the table. The grand ballroom of the Senate Hotel had 3 broad steps separating the raised dining area from the dance floor in the center, and Salvatore Rocca descended those 3 steps very slowly. He didn't hurry. He didn't roll up his sleeves, point a finger, or raise his voice. Yet the crowd closing in around Josie parted before him on its own, not because anyone ordered them to move, but in the way people instinctively step back when something heavy passes through. At the final step, he stopped and looked at the hand of the security guard gripping Josie's arm. He didn't say anything. The guard had been doing this work for more than 10 years, and he released her in less than 2 seconds. Salvatore bent down. He picked up the steel tray first and set it upright, then gathered the 2 empty glasses that had rolled across the carpet and placed them back on the tray. The entire ballroom watched in silence as the wealthiest man in the room bent down to collect empty glasses. Finally, he picked up the ring. He held it between 2 fingers, turned it once beneath the chandelier light, and examined it for about 3 seconds, with the expression of a man assessing the value of an object before handing it to the security guard. Take this to the reception desk. File a lost property report with the recipient's signature and the time recorded. Don't hand it directly to anyone. The guard took the ring and left. Then Salvatore turned toward Josie. She was still standing in the same place, her arms hanging at her sides, and now that she no longer had the tray to hold, she didn't know what to do with her hands. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, then raised his hands and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He took it off and draped it over her shoulders. Somewhere in the ballroom, someone drew in a quiet breath. The jacket was far too large for her, its shoulders falling almost to her elbows, and Josie stood motionless beneath the unexpected weight of the fabric, afraid to move, unable to understand what was happening to her. Because in the world she'd lived in for the past 4 years, no one did this. People might pity her. They might give her money, leftover food, or a kind piece of advice before walking away. But no one stood beside her in front of 200 people and allowed all 200 of them to see that they were standing beside her. Salvatore quickly adjusted the collar around her shoulders, the way someone straightened something that had fallen out of place. Then he turned to face the ballroom. "This woman works in my home," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was so quiet that the people standing farthest away had to lean forward, and for that very reason, the entire ballroom fell completely silent to hear him clearly. "Her name is Josephine Hartwell. From this moment forward, no one in this room will refer to her as the little server or that woman again." He paused. "Someone just accused her of theft. It happened in the middle of this ballroom, in front of all of you, so in the interest of fairness, I will speak in the middle of the ballroom as well." His gaze moved slowly across the crowd from left to right, missing no one. "Anyone in this room who believes she stole that ring is invited to come see me tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. My home is in Beacon Hill. You all know the way. I will listen to everything you have to say without interrupting, and I will answer each of you personally." No one moved. There were 200 people in the Senate ballroom that night, including the chairman of 3 shipping companies, 2 city council members, 4 journalists, and enough lawyers to fill a courtroom. Not one of them lifted a foot. Salvatore allowed the silence to stretch beyond what was comfortable, long enough for everyone in the room to hear it and to understand that everyone around them was hearing it too. Then he turned toward Pierce. "Mr. Ashcroft, you just said you left the ring in the pocket of your coat hanging over a chair." "That's right." Pierce's voice was still firm, but it had risen noticeably higher than before. "Which chair?" Silence followed. "At my table." "Which table number?" Pierce opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes darted quickly toward the row of tables behind him, and everyone standing nearby saw the glance. "I'm only asking sincerely," Salvatore said, his voice still as mild as though he were asking the time. "This hotel has cameras. 3 in the main ballroom, 2 in the hallway, and 1 directly above the tables. Someone only needs to rewind the footage to see when the ring was inside your coat pocket and when it left. It is a simple matter. If someone truly stole it from you, you should ask them to retrieve the footage now, before everyone goes home. And that was the moment Pierce Ashcroft's face changed. The change was quick and slight, not enough for anyone standing 5 meters away to notice. But Josie was only 3 steps from him, and she saw everything. She saw that the smile remained on his lips, while his eyes left Salvatore's face and moved toward the corner of the ceiling. She saw him swallow once. She saw his hands, which had been resting confidently on his hips, drop and search for somewhere to hide inside his trouser pockets. He laughed. The sound was dry and brief, and it fell into the silent ballroom without anyone there to catch it. "All right," he said. "The ring has been found, so let it go. I don't want to ruin everyone's evening over something so small. Then you don't want the camera footage reviewed. I just said to let it go." "Very well," Salvatore said. "Then I will note that you declined to request it." He turned his back on Pierce, placed one hand very lightly against Josie's back, only enough for her to understand that she should walk, and guided her toward the side door. The crowd parted once more. Behind them, in the center of the Senate Hotel's grand ballroom, a 23-year-old man remained standing alone beneath the chandeliers, with both hands in his trouser pockets, and for the first time in his life, he understood the name of the feeling running down his spine. Bruno Ferraro was in the Senate Hotel security room at 9 o'clock the following morning, and he remained there for nearly 2 hours. The night shift supervisor was a man around 50, who had worked at the hotel for 18 years, and he didn't conceal anything. That was the worst part. He opened the system log on the screen for Bruno, scrolled to the exact time frame, and there, among the monotonous lines of text, was an entry highlighted in yellow. 9:31 in the evening. The main ballroom camera cluster stopped recording. At 9:32 and 30 seconds, normal recording resumed. 90 seconds. Bruno asked why. The supervisor turned the screen, opened another window, and pointed to the note. Scheduled quarterly software update. The schedule had been prepared by the maintenance contractor 3 weeks earlier, approved by hotel management, with the signer's name and the date of approval clearly recorded. The system ran its updates automatically during preset time slots, and one of those slots happened to fall at 9:31 on Saturday night. Bruno asked whether there was any backup recording. There wasn't. What about the camera above the row of tables? The same cluster, the same interruption. Who had chosen that particular time slot? The supervisor said honestly that he didn't know, that the contractor handled those matters, that it happened several times every year and nothing had ever gone wrong before. Bruno sat without speaking for a moment, then asked his final question. 3 weeks earlier, when the update schedule had been created, had the guest list for the fundraiser already been available? The supervisor thought for a moment, then said yes. The list had been sent to the hotel at the beginning of the month. That afternoon, Bruno delivered his report in the Rocca study, brief and without embellishment. There was no footage. There was no way to prove when the ring had left Pierce Ashcroft's coat pocket. More important, there was no way to prove who had arranged that 90-second gap because, on paper, it was a perfectly legitimate maintenance procedure, approved 3 weeks in advance by people who appeared to have no connection to anyone involved. Salvatore asked whether the maintenance contractor could be traced. Bruno said yes, and he'd already traced it, and the contractor was an ordinary company with service agreements at 17 hotels across the city. Nothing unusual. Nothing at all. So it is clean, Salvatore said. Clean, Bruno replied. So clean it frightens me. The police never came. No report was filed, and no accusation was formally made, because the ring had been placed at the reception desk with a complete lost property report, including the recipient's signature and the time, and the man claiming to own it had publicly refused to request the camera footage in front of 200 people. Legally, Josephine Hartwell hadn't been accused of anything. Legally, the incident had never happened. But there is another kind of court that requires no documents, no evidence, and never hands down a verdict of innocence. On Monday morning, a local newspaper published a brief item on an inside page under City Life. The article named No One. It said that the Harbor Commission fundraiser had experienced an awkward moment involving a piece of jewelry and a member of the service staff, that the matter had later been resolved internally, and that several guests had expressed concerns about the screening procedures for employees working at events with security considerations. 340 words. Not a single name. No names were necessary because there had been 200 people in the Senate ballroom that night, and each of those 200 people told the story to at least 5 others. And by the third day, it had traveled through the entire narrow world of those who did business along Boston Harbor. Josie didn't learn about it from the newspaper. She learned through things far smaller. The coffee vendor on the corner of Charles Street, who usually asked how she was every morning, handed her the cup that day and turned away to wipe the counter. A woman who lived on the same floor of her apartment building, someone she'd only met the day before, pressed the elevator button and went up without waiting for Josie to step inside. No one said anything to her. That was how it worked. People didn't condemn you. They only left a very small distance where no distance had existed before, and that distance couldn't be challenged in court, couldn't be explained to anyone, and never truly closed. On Tuesday afternoon, a courier delivered a rigid envelope to the Beacon Hill mansion, addressed personally to Salvatore Rocca. Inside were 2 things. The first was a typed letter on Ashcroft Maritime letterhead, signed by Randall Ashcroft and written in language of flawless courtesy. It stated that because of the sensitive nature of the container terminal contract, and because certain recent events might affect the reputations of the participating parties, he respectfully requested that the Rocca Group consider withdrawing its proposal within 72 hours to avoid unnecessary complications for both sides. The second item came with no explanation. It was a copy of an employment application. Ordinary paper, a standard printed form, completed by hand. Name, Josephine Hartwell. Position requested, domestic household employee. Date submitted, 14 months earlier. Her signature appeared at the bottom of the page, and Salvatore immediately recognized that it wasn't a copy taken from his own personnel files, because the version in his house carried a received date stamp in the upper right corner, while this one did not, which meant it had been copied from somewhere else, which meant that somewhere beyond those walls, for the past 4 years, someone had been keeping every piece of paper that carried Josephine Hartwell's name. Salvatore placed the 2 documents side by side on the desk. Bruno stood across from him and waited. "He isn't threatening me with the contract," Salvatore said. "He has just shown me where he intends to strike." It took Bruno Ferraro 9 days to follow that trail to its end, and he reported what he'd found in the study on a Thursday evening, standing rather than sitting, a thin stack of papers in his hand. The $40,000 had been transferred into the hospital's account by a consulting company in Delaware, formed 11 months earlier, with no employees and no revenue. That company was owned by a holding company in Wilmington. The holding company was an asset of a limited liability partnership registered in Providence. And that partnership, at the final layer, had only one beneficiary, the Ashcroft Family Trust. Salvatore read all 4 pages without skipping a single line. Then he set them down. "It took you 9 days. Yes, you're better than that." Bruno nodded slowly, and that was his answer. "Mr. Rocca, I've been doing this work for nearly 30 years. When people want to hide money, they move it overseas, through banks that don't share information, through places I couldn't reach even if I spent 3 years looking. 4 layers of domestic companies, all publicly registered, all searchable through the corporate registry for a $30 fee." He placed the stack of papers on the desk. "This isn't hiding. This is putting on a raincoat and standing in full sunlight. It is enough for him to deny it in court if anyone asks. It isn't enough to hide it from me. It was never meant to hide it from me." Salvatore sat perfectly still. "He wants me to know. He wants you to know," Bruno said, "and he wants her to know." A long silence filled the study. Salvatore rose, walked to the window, and stood looking down at the dark street. In his mind, every piece had just fallen into place, and the picture they formed was so clean that it sent a chill along his spine. Randall Ashcroft hadn't bought Josephine Hartwell's silence. Had he wanted to buy it, he would have attached a condition, a phone call, a message, something she could refuse. But he'd attached nothing. He'd paid the money, stamped the receipt, and slipped it through the crack in her door without a single word. Because what he'd bought wasn't her silence. What he'd bought was her position inside this house. A servant indebted to her employer's enemy was no longer simply a servant. She became a question. In every room she entered, in every conversation that stopped when she passed, someone would always think, she took $40,000 from the other side, and no one knows what she gave them in return. It didn't need to be proven. It didn't need to be true. The thought only had to exist, and once it existed, there was no way to remove it. just like the tiny distance the people in her apartment building had begun leaving around her since Monday morning. He didn't buy her, Salvatore said, turning back. He poisoned the ground beneath her feet. Are you going to tell her? How long do you think I can hide it? Bruno didn't answer. Salvatore picked up the papers. If I hide it, then when she learns the truth on her own, she'll understand that I knew beforehand and allowed her to live in my house like someone under suspicion. At that point, I will have finished the rest of his work for him. Josie was called to the study at 9 o'clock that evening, after the house had gone quiet. Salvatore didn't speak in circles. He placed the papers in front of her and told her to read them, and she did, slowly, her lips moving with each line like someone trying to make certain she hadn't misunderstood the words. She read to the final page. She read the name on the last line. Then she placed the paper on the desk very gently and sat without moving. Miss Hartwell. She didn't answer. Miss Hartwell. Josie stood. In the frighteningly calm voice of someone who had lost all feeling in her skin, she asked for permission to step outside for a moment, then left the study, walked the length of the hallway, and sat on the 4th step of the servants' staircase, leading down to the kitchen. The darkest place in the house. The place where members of the staff sat to remove their shoes. She sat there with both arms wrapped around her elbows. 4 years earlier, her father had gone to work the night shift at Pier 7 and had never come home. They called it a workplace accident. They gave his family a piece of paper, a compensation payment, and a typed expression of sympathy. And 11 days later, they took her name as well. For 4 years, she'd lived with that knowledge inside her chest like a piece of metal, and she'd learned how to breathe around it. And now the man standing at the far end of everything that had happened had paid $40,000 to save her brother. He hadn't demanded anything. He hadn't sent a single word. He hadn't mentioned the boy's name, not even once. Josie sat on the dark stair and understood the trap. She understood it completely, down to every edge and corner. If she spoke, if she stood up and told the truth about Pier 7, she would become the woman accusing the very man who had just saved her brother's life. No one in the world would stand beside a woman like that. People would call her ungrateful. They would say she'd taken the money and then turned against him. And if she remained silent, if she accepted the gift and went on living, then she would become the woman who had traded her father for her brother's surgery, and she would have to live with that every day. Every time she saw the boy run across the room, there was no third door. He had closed both doors at the same time with a receipt slipped through the crack in her door, without a single threat, without laying one finger on her. On the dark stair, Josephine Hartwell lowered her head to her knees, and for the first time in 4 years, she didn't know what she was supposed to wake up for the next morning. Josie returned to work the following morning because she didn't know what else to do. For 3 days, she cleaned that house like a machine, and Mrs. Ruth left her alone, assigning her only tasks on the upper floors, where she wouldn't have to see anyone. On Monday afternoon, Mrs. Ruth told her to go up to the study and clean the bookshelves, because the master would be out until evening. Josie carried up a cloth and a ladder. The Rocca study had bookshelves covering all 4 walls from floor to ceiling, and in the farthest corner, behind the armchair, there was a low compartment filled with document boxes. She pulled the ladder over, and when she lifted out the stack of boxes to wipe the shelf behind them, the lid of the bottom box came loose. The box tipped sideways, and a file slid out and fell onto the carpet. Josie bent down to pick it up. The folder was brown, the same kind Bruno always used, and on the label attached to its spine were 2 handwritten words, Hartwell, J. She meant to put it back inside the box. She truly meant to do that. She could still remember the exact thought, that it wasn't her concern, that the compartment wasn't included in the list Mrs. Ruth had given her. But her hands opened the file before the thought had time to reach its end. There were more than a dozen pages inside, a copy of the court record from 4 years earlier, with several lines underlined in pencil, a copy of her father's death certificate, with workplace accident listed as the cause, a printed page containing the names of the night shift workers at Pier 7, the addresses of the 3 apartments she'd rented, arranged in chronological order, the name of the hospital, the name of Toby's elementary school, and on top, the first page, was a typed note, only half a page long, summarizing everything beneath it, brief and dry like an inventory list. In the upper right corner of that page was a date. Josie read it. Then she read it again. Then she lowered herself onto the carpet among the document boxes and took out her phone to open the calendar and count for herself, because she no longer trusted her own memory. She remembered very clearly the day she'd submitted her application to work in that house. She remembered because it had been raining, and she'd had to dry the form beneath the hand dryer in a public restroom before she dared give it to anyone. She counted. The note in her hand had been created 11 days before that date. 11 days before she'd ever stepped through those gates. 11 days before anyone in that house should have been able to know she existed. Josie sat on the floor of the study for a very long time. Outside, the daylight slowly faded, and she didn't turn on another lamp. Inside her mind, one event after another returned and rearranged itself into a different order, and that was the cruelest part, because everything fit perfectly. The interview she'd always remembered with relief because they'd asked so few questions. Mrs. Ruth hadn't asked a single thing about the 4-year gap in her employment history. The night she'd broken the glass and Mrs. Ruth had looked down at the shards with the expression of someone who had been waiting for that moment for a very long time. The sentence she'd spoken in the kitchen, that they had known from the first day, not the first week, but the first day, even before Josie came for the interview, and that the master had read the file before she had. Josie had heard those words then, and hadn't understood. Now she did. They hadn't discovered her. They had gone looking for her. For 14 months, she'd lived inside that house with gratitude buried so deeply within her that she hadn't dared speak of it to anyone. Gratitude because someone had given her work when the entire city had closed its doors. Gratitude because someone had walked around through the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night so he wouldn't step on the floor she'd just cleaned. She'd thought it was kindness. It turned out she was a name inside a box in the corner of a study. Found, examined, brought into the house, and kept there until the day she became useful. The daughter of the foreman who died at Pier 7, the only living witness. She thought of the previous evening, of the 4-page report that man had placed in front of her, of what he'd said, that if he hid the truth from her, he would only finish the rest of Randall's work for him. At the time, she'd believed he was being honest. Now she sat on the floor and thought, no, he wasn't honest. He had merely calculated one move faster than the other man. 2 men sat at opposite ends of a chessboard, and throughout the past 4 years, she had never been a player. She had always been the thing lying on the board. Josie returned the file to the box. She arranged all the boxes neatly, in their original order, closed the lids, and pushed them back against the wall. She finished wiping the shelf as Mrs. Ruth had instructed, put away the ladder, carried the cloth down to the laundry room, washed it clean, and hung it in its proper place. Then she went to the small room beside the kitchen where the staff kept their belongings. She changed her clothes. She folded the gray uniform carefully, tucking both sleeves inward and smoothing every crease, the way she'd folded thousands of towels during the past 14 months. She placed it neatly in the center of the bed. She removed the gate key and the kitchen door key from her key ring and laid them on top of the uniform. She didn't write anything. She couldn't think of a single sentence that wouldn't be an apology, and she'd apologized more than enough in her life. Mrs. Ruth was in the dining room. Bruno hadn't returned, and the master was away. Josie placed her bag over her shoulder, left through the kitchen door, crossed the gravel courtyard, and walked out through the gates of the Roca house at 7:15 on Monday evening. She didn't turn back to look at the house. She walked toward the subway station, and inside her coat pocket, folded into quarters, was still the hospital receipt bearing the circular seal in the lower right corner. At 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the South Station bus terminal smelled of cold coffee and diesel fuel, and Josie sat in a row of plastic seats near Gate 7 with a handbag and a rolling suitcase. She'd bought a ticket to Worcester on the 7:10 bus because an old friend of her mother's worked in a hospital cafeteria there, and because Worcester was far enough away that no one would remember her face. Mrs. Delphine would look after Toby for another 10 days. Josie had lied and told her she was leaving for a temporary job out of town, and Mrs. Delphine had studied her for a moment before saying, "All right, you go. The boy has me, but remember to call every evening." Josie was watching the departure board when someone pulled out a chair and sat down 1 seat away from her. She didn't need to turn her head to know who it was because, in that crowded bus terminal that morning, there was only one man wearing a dark suit. Salvatore Rocca didn't greet her. He placed an already opened envelope on the plastic seat between them. "You don't have to listen to me," he said. "Your bus leaves at 7:10. You have 40 minutes. You can sit there without saying anything." Josie didn't answer. He took out the first item and placed it on the seat. It was an old photograph, printed on paper, yellowed around the edges, showing a man in his 60s standing in front of a market stall with a scale in his hand. He was smiling the way people smile when someone takes their picture before they're ready. "My father," Salvatore said. "This was taken at the North End Market. He sold fish there 30 years ago, before he began doing other things." Then he took out the second item. It was a printed copy of a document with a faded archive stamp in one corner. At the top of the page was the name of a harbor authority, and beneath it was a table filled with columns of numbers. He placed one finger on a sequence in the third column. "This is the shipment code recorded in the inspection report your father refused to sign. You don't need to know what it means. You only need to look at these numbers." Then he turned the page over, where another table appeared, and placed his finger on a second sequence. "And this is the shipment code in the file my father was holding in November 5 years ago, 3 days before he died." Josie looked down. The two sequences differed in their final 4 digits. The first 7 characters were identical. "The same route," Salvatore said. "The same operator. The same approving signature." He drew back his hand. "Your father went to work the night shift at Pier 7 and never came home. My father walked out of a restaurant on Hanover Street and never came home. 11 months apart. It took me 5 years not to see this. Miss Hartwell, I only saw it 3 weeks ago, after someone mentioned November to me over lunch." Josie remained silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice rough from not sleeping all night. "You found me before I submitted my application." "Yes." 11 days before." "Yes." "Then you're no different from him," she said. "You're only more polite." Salvatore didn't argue. He sat looking toward Gate 7, where people were lining up to board another bus. "I looked for you because I needed to know whether anyone had survived that night at Pier 7, he said. "You're right about that, and I won't deny it. But listen to the rest. I found you in March of last year. 14 months ago. Think back over those 14 months, and tell me how many questions I asked you." Josie didn't answer because the answer was none. "I could have questioned you during your first week," he continued. "I could have called you into the study, placed your father's file on the desk, and told you to speak. I could have offered you 3 times your wages and promised to take care of your brother. You needed money, so you would have talked. I know how to do that, Miss Hartwell. I've done it all my life." He turned and looked at her. "But 4 years ago, someone forced you to say what they wanted to hear. They handed you a piece of paper, and they took your name away. If I forced you to open your mouth too, how would I be any different from them? Except for wanting a different answer." He stood and buttoned his jacket. "I didn't hire you to use you. I waited for you to speak on your own, because forcing a witness to talk is exactly what they did to you, and I would rather lose that contract than do the same." He left the photograph and the document on the seat. "Your bus will be leaving soon. Have a safe journey." He'd gone about 10 steps when Josie called after him. Her voice wasn't loud, but he stopped. "Mr. Rocca." She stood with one hand still gripping the handle of her suitcase. "I didn't see anything that night." Salvatore turned around. "I wasn't at the harbor. I've never set foot on Pier 7 in my life." She spoke, and her voice began to tremble. "Not from fear, but from 4 years pressing against it all at once. This entire city thinks I'm a witness. They took my name because they believed I was. You came looking for me because you believed it too. But I have nothing. Do you understand? I've never had anything." The two of them stood facing each other in the middle of the bus terminal. Then Josie continued more slowly, as though she'd only just heard the meaning of her own words. "I only have a box of things my father sent home." Salvatore didn't move. "When did he send it?" "1 day before he died. The post office delivered it that afternoon, and my mother signed for it. His coat was inside, his broken watch, and several notebooks from work." She shrugged, and there was something so helpless in that small movement that he had to look away. "They've been under my bed for 4 years. I haven't opened them again. I couldn't." 40 minutes later, the 7:10 bus left the terminal without Josephine Hartwell aboard. In the 3rd-floor apartment, the cardboard box was pulled from beneath the bed and opened, releasing the smell of old fabric and dust. Josie took out 3 hardbound notebooks of the kind harbor workers used, their corners curled and their spines worn. She handed them to him. Salvatore opened the top notebook. Inside, dark pencil handwriting filled every page, line after line of numbers, container codes, vessel numbers, dates, times, initialed signatures. He turned one page, then a second. On the 3rd page, his hand stopped, and he looked up at her, and on the face of the quietest man in Boston was something Josie had never seen there before. "Miss Hartwell," he he said. Do you know what you've been holding in your hands for the past 4 years? The 3 notebooks were brought back to Beacon Hill that afternoon, and Bruno Ferraro sat with them for 7 straight hours beside a comparison report obtained from the registration office. At 11 o'clock that night, he knocked on the study door and said only one sentence, that there were 23 shipments recorded in the notebooks which, according to the harbor's official files, had never existed. Salvatore asked what they needed to bring the matter forward. Bruno said they needed access to the Harbor Commission's inspection archives, and they needed someone still alive to confirm who the notebooks belonged to. Josie sat in the room with dust from the cardboard box still on her hands, and she said she would testify. Salvatore told her to go home and rest, and that they would discuss it again the following day. She stepped into the hallway, and beneath the wall lamp, Ruth Calloway was waiting. She was wearing her coat, and she carried her handbag, the kind of handbag people only carried when they intended to go somewhere. Miss Hartwell, she said, there is something I have to tell you. Afterward, you may do whatever you wish with me. The 3 of them sat together in the dining room with only one light turned on. Mrs. Ruth placed her handbag beside the leg of her chair and didn't look at either of them. She stared at the wooden tabletop. Before I came to this house, she said, I worked for the Ashcroft family, head housekeeper. 9 years. Josie sat very straight. The entire room was silent. The night the jewelry was reported missing, Mrs. Ruth said, I was in the house. I was responsible for the keys. The next morning, Mr. Ashcroft called me into his office. He didn't shout. He poured me a cup of tea. Then he placed a typed statement in front of me, complete except for my signature, and told me that according to my memory, I had seen you go upstairs at around 9 o'clock the previous evening. She paused. I didn't see you. You never went upstairs. You were in the kitchen with me from 8 until nearly 10 that night, washing every dish from the party. You even asked me how to remove a wine stain from a tablecloth. Josie said nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, and they began to tremble, but she left them there. I was 59 years old, Mrs. Ruth said. I'd done this work my entire life. I had no degree, no home of my own, and a younger sister in a nursing facility whose monthly fees were exactly equal to my wages. He didn't threaten me. He only said that if my memory wasn't clear, he understood, and that his household probably needed someone younger. She looked down at her hands. I signed it. I signed at 9:20 on Thursday morning, and I remember even the time. No one spoke for a very long while. Mrs. Ruth continued, her voice even and steady, and that steadiness was what made it hardest to hear. They kept me for another 2 months. Then I resigned. I didn't give a reason, and no one asked. I began working in this house that autumn. She turned toward Salvatore. Mr. Rocca, the name I gave Mr. Ferraro in March of last year, was one I found myself. No one told me to do it. It took me 2 years to discover where she was living. I asked people I knew in domestic service, and I lied that I was looking to hire someone. Then I told Mr. Ferraro that I'd heard the daughter of the foreman who died at Pier 7 needed work, and that this house was short of staff. She turned back toward Josie. I knew this house would investigate you. I knew the master would read the file, and I knew he wouldn't dismiss you because of it, because I'd worked here long enough to know the kind of man he is. She drew in a breath. I brought you into the only house in Boston where the paper I signed would have no power. That was all I could think to do. Josie raised her eyes. She looked at the woman sitting opposite her, the woman who had torn the court record in half in the kitchen, who had knelt to gather the broken glass without asking a single question, who had told her to join the service staff at the fundraiser after she'd lost both of her other jobs and needed every dollar. The kindest woman Josie had met in 4 years. You knew, Josie said. Her voice was very small. For 14 months, you knew. You looked at me every day. Yes, Mrs. Ruth said. Every day. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was a coward, she answered without hesitating for even a second. I could tell you something else if you wanted. I could say I was afraid you'd leave, that I wanted to care for you long enough before telling you. But the truth is that every morning I saw you standing in the kitchen, and I promised myself I would tell you that evening. And every evening, I decided it still wasn't the right time. More than 400 days like that. She bent down and picked up her handbag. Now I have nowhere left to postpone it. She stood, buttoned her coat, and turned toward Salvatore. Mr. Rocca. If the notebooks Mr. Ferraro is reading are going to have any value. Someone has to reopen the case from 4 years ago. And to reopen it, someone has to withdraw their statement. She pulled up the collar of her coat. I called the police department this afternoon. Inspector Kowalski is on duty tonight, and he told me to come in. Mrs. Calloway. Salvatore rose. Do you understand what giving false testimony in a criminal case means? I'm 63 years old, she said. Of course I understand. I have lawyers. Wait until tomorrow morning, and I'll send someone with you. No. Mrs. Ruth shook her head, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked slightly. You're kind, but no. If I wait until morning, I'll postpone it for one more day. I know myself. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped, turned back toward Josie, and spoke one final sentence. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Don't forgive me yet. Do you hear me? I took 4 years from you. 4 years can't be erased in one evening. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. A 63-year-old woman in an old wool coat, carrying her handbag as she walked toward the police station. The Rocca family's lawyer arrived at 8 o'clock the following morning and explained the mechanism in exactly 4 minutes. The inspection archives of the Boston Harbor Commission couldn't be opened at the request of a private individual. To open the complete records of an operating route during a specific period, someone had to file a formal complaint challenging the integrity of the licensing process, and that complaint had to be submitted by a legal entity with standing in the industry. The complaint would trigger a public hearing, and within the Commission's regulations was a provision that had existed for more than 30 years, created to prevent contractors from using complaints as weapons to destroy one another, stating that any party filing a complaint connected to an open contract would be automatically disqualified from that same contract, with no exceptions and no appeal. Bruno Ferraro rose from his chair before the lawyer finished the final sentence. No. Salvatore didn't answer. Mr. Rocca, listen to me. $200 million. I know that isn't $200 million in profit, but it means 30 years of operations, 400 jobs, and the one thing that has kept people from mentioning the Rocca name alongside the old stories for the past 5 years. He placed both hands on the table. You spent 5 years buying that. One permit at a time. I sat beside you through every meeting. Now you sign one piece of paper and lose all of it, permanently, because this contract only opens once every 30 years. I know. And what do you gain? Bruno's voice grew louder, and it was the first time in more than 10 years that he'd raised it inside that house. A dead man's notebook. A housekeeper who turned herself in last night. Are you certain the commission will open the archives? No one is certain. You sign, they reject the complaint, and you lose the contract without gaining anything at all. Salvatore remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was as quiet as ever. Mr. Ferraro, 5 years ago, you stood beside me in a hospital corridor at 4 o'clock in the morning. Do you remember what I asked you? Bruno didn't answer. I asked what we were supposed to do next. You told me the matter couldn't be reopened, that we should leave it alone, that the living had to take care of the living. Salvatore picked up the pen. You were right at the time, but I've left it alone for 5 years. And during those 5 years, he has continued eating lunch at the Thornbury Club every Wednesday. He pulled the complaint toward him. If I keep the contract, I keep a harbor terminal. If I sign, I may gain nothing at all. But there is one thing I know with certainty. If I don't sign, then someday another person will go to work the night shift and never come home, and I will be the man who calculated that it was cheaper. He signed. The complaint was filed at 11 o'clock that morning. Within 48 hours, the Rocca name was removed from the list of bidders for the container terminal, and the news traveled through Boston Harbor faster than anything the local newspapers could print. The Harbor Commission hearing opened the following Tuesday morning in the large meeting room on the 4th floor of the Harbor Administration Building, chaired by Commissioner Francis Doyle. The room held 70 seats, and everyone was occupied. The first 3 rows were reserved for parties with a direct interest in the proceedings, and the press sat behind them. Randall Ashcroft occupied a seat in the second row with 2 lawyers. Pierce wasn't present. Josephine Hartwell was called at 9:40. She walked alone from the back of the room to the witness table without a lawyer beside her because she'd refused one. Salvatore had offered twice, and both times she'd said no. That if a man in a suit stood beside her and spoke on her behalf, the entire room would hear his voice instead of hers. She placed the 3 notebooks on the table in front of her and began to speak. She told them about her father, who had worked the night shift at Pier 7 for 22 years. She told them about the cardboard box delivered to their home by the post office one September afternoon, the box her mother had signed for, and how 31 hours later, someone had knocked on the door to bring the news. She opened the first notebook and read aloud 2 handwritten lines, a container code, and a date and time, then explained that according to the harbor's comparison records, the shipment had never existed. Her voice trembled during the first sentence, then gradually grew steadier, and there was a moment, lasting about 3 minutes, when all 70 people in the room sat in silence listening to a 26-year-old woman speak about her father. Then the lawyer for Ashcroft Maritime asked for permission to respond, and everything began to collapse. He never raised his voice. He thanked the witness and said his client offered the deepest condolences for the Hartwell family's loss. Then he asked 3 questions. First, had she been present at Pier 7 that night? Josie said no. Second, were the 3 notebooks official harbor documents? Were they stamped, assigned archive numbers, or entered into any formal system? Josie said no. They were her father's private work notebooks. Third, who could confirm that the handwriting belonged to Walter Hartwell? Josie said, I can. The lawyer nodded and turned toward the chairwoman's table. He stated that what had just been presented consisted of personal notes, with no legal standing, no archival provenance, no third-party verification, written by a man who was now deceased and identified by an immediate family member. A family member, he added very gently, who was currently employed in the household of the party that had just filed a complaint against his client. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Then Randall Ashcroft requested permission to speak, and he stood and talked about his family's 18 years of operating Pier 7, about their workplace safety record, about the compensation that had been paid in full to the Hartwell family that year, and he said he sincerely hoped Miss Hartwell would find peace, and that he understood how grief could lead people to search for answers in places where no answers existed. Papers rustled in the room. A journalist in the back row closed his notebook. Commissioner Frances Doyle looked down at the file before her, and Josie stood at the witness table with both hands resting on the 3 notebooks, and she could see with perfect clarity, just as everyone else in the room could see with perfect clarity, that she was losing. Commissioner Frances Doyle had lifted her pen to enter a note into the record when the door at the back of the hearing room opened. The sound of the hinges was unmistakable in the silent room, and all 70 heads turned at once. Pierce Ashcroft stood in the doorway without a lawyer beside him, holding a thin plastic folder. He didn't look at anyone in the room. He walked straight toward the chairwoman's table, and in the second row, Randall Ashcroft slowly placed one hand on the back of the chair in front of him. I would like permission to submit a document, Pierce said. His voice no longer had the resonance he usually used to fill a room. It was dry and thin. What is your connection to this matter? Commissioner Doyle asked. I'm Pierce Ashcroft. According to the corporate records, I've been a member of the Ashcroft Maritime Board of Directors since I was 19 years old. He placed the folder on the table. I took this document from the company's internal server last night. I still have access because no one thought to revoke it. Both attorneys for Ashcroft Maritime rose at the same time. Commissioner Doyle raised one hand and instructed them to sit, then opened the folder. Inside was a printed copy of a container inspection report dated 4 years earlier for the Pier 7 operating route, and at the bottom of the page, instead of a handwritten signature, there was an electronic signature block containing an authentication code, a timestamp, and a name. Pierce Ashcroft. Commissioner Doyle read it very slowly. Then she looked up. Did you sign this report? No, Pierce said. 4 years ago, I was at Oxford. I never signed this. Someone in the room drew in a breath. I studied in England for 3 years, he continued, his eyes still fixed on the chairwoman's table. I returned to the United States exactly 3 times, and there are immigration records proving it. On the date shown on that document, I was still there, but that doesn't save me because an electronic signature doesn't require someone to be physically present. It only requires the code, and my father has had my code since I was 19. From the day he placed me on the board and told me to sign something I didn't read. He placed one hand on the folder. Over the past 4 years, there have been 23 inspection reports carrying my code. I counted them last night. I didn't write a single word in any of them. Randall Ashcroft stood in the second row. Pierce. His son didn't turn around. That was the detail everyone present that day would remember for years afterward. that he never looked back even once. "I didn't come here to apologize to anyone," Pierce told Commissioner Doyle. "I know there are people in this room who deserve to hear me apologize. But I came because I finally understood that when this comes apart, the person who goes to prison will be the person whose name is on the paper. From the beginning, the name on the paper has been mine." The hearing was suspended at 10:15. The Boston Harbor Commission ordered the complete inspection archives for the Pier 7 operating route over a 5-year period to be opened and transferred the records to federal investigators. In addition, the statement Mrs. Ruth Calloway had voluntarily given to Inspector Warren Kowalski caused the case from 4 years earlier to be reopened, and 2 months later, the court overturned Josephine Hartwell's conviction and erased her entire criminal record. Mrs. Calloway was prosecuted for making a false statement and received a suspended sentence because she'd surrendered voluntarily. On the day she left the courthouse, a 26-year-old woman was waiting for her on the steps and reached out to help her down. Randall Ashcroft was charged with 19 offenses, including falsifying documents, defrauding the federal contracting process, and obstructing justice. Ashcroft Maritime shares lost 4/5 of their value within 6 weeks. On the day of his first court appearance, he entered the courtroom wearing a $3,000 suit, clean-shaven, and paused for a single beat in the aisle between the rows of seats, following the lifelong habit of a man accustomed to having someone rise when he entered. There were more than 60 people in that courtroom. Not one of them stood. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon at the East Boston waterfront, a 9-year-old boy ran along the safety railing beside the water, both arms raised as he pointed toward a blue container ship being guided into the harbor by tugboats. He ran for a while, then turned around and shouted that the ship was much larger than the one he'd built, that he'd already counted at least 200 containers and was still counting. Mrs. Delphine sat on a nearby stone bench with a bag of cake in her hands, reminding him not to run so fast. Josephine Hartwell leaned against the railing and watched her brother. She no longer wore a gray uniform. She wore a sweater and jeans, her hair tied low, and there was a smear of paint on her sleeve from that morning when the two siblings had repainted the bookshelf in their new apartment. Footsteps sounded on the concrete behind her. Then a paper cup of coffee appeared at eye level. Salvatore Rocca stood beside her, still holding a second cup, the collar of his coat raised against the wind blowing in from the water. They stood there for a while, watching the ship enter the harbor and listening to the boy count in the distance. "What are we having for dinner?" he asked. Josie laughed. "Mrs. Delphine has already cooked. She said she'll be angry if you don't come." "Then I'll come. Some lives have many things taken from them, and some things can never be restored once they're gone. No one could return Josephine Hartwell's 4 lost years. But this story leaves us with 3 things worth carrying forward. First, a person's dignity isn't found in the clothes they wear or the work they do, but in the way they hold themselves when no one is left to defend them. Second, remaining silent in order to survive isn't cowardice, because there are circumstances in which silence is the only way to protect the people we love. But a day will come when we must stand up and speak, and that day often comes when we feel we have nothing left to lose. And third, the truly powerful person isn't the one capable of destroying others, but the one who holds enough power to do so and still chooses the right path, even when that path costs far more. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can have more deeply moving stories to listen to. We would truly like to know how Josephine's story made you feel, so please leave a comment below and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We read every single line. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.